Next up, over the last couple of weeks, we've been joined by UNL Beef Systems Specialist Mary Drewnoski to discuss some strategies for meeting your cattle's forage needs this fall and winter. Whether it's how to properly utilize high-nitrate forage or taking advantage of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's crop residue exchange program, the one common thread in all these stories has been dealing with this year's drought. With drought bearing down on several of Nebraska's surrounding states, there has been an increase in cattle producers who are looking to send their cattle to other locations where winter feed resources might be a bit more available. In this last installment of our three-part cattle care series, Mary gives us some things to think about before finalizing any winter cattle care agreements. With unyielding drought conditions in several areas of the United States, there has been a noticeable uptick in cattle producers seeking to ship their cattle to places like Nebraska, where they might be able to secure winter feed resources for their herd. While the old handshake agreement is still used in practice today and symbolic of trust, you'll want to have a written agreement just to refer to as different scenarios begin to unfold. This raises the question of what to ask yourself and other parties involved about what constitutes a fair agreement for cattle care through the winter months.
Having it in writing has nothing to do with trust. It actually has a lot to do with your ability to make sure that you have communicated everything that you wanted to, that everybody's on the same page, and most importantly, is so that you remember what you agreed to. Especially if somebody has multiple agreements with multiple parties, it can become very easy to forget who you agreed to do what with, right? The other thing is that you may decide that, previously you had said one thing, you changed your mind, this year you discussed something else, and now you can't remember what it was. So it's really about, it's a memory for both parties, and I don't think you have to really be thinking about it. It's not because I don't trust you, and I think you can have that discussion. I think most people understand that if I have it in writing, it's going to be more clear. I can refer back to it. And then if there are still some things that aren't clear, it's really easy to say, oh, well, it wasn't in here, so we need to discuss this. Rather than thinking, well, I think I know what the other party agreed to. Now you're like, we didn't actually talk about that. Maybe we should.
When there's one party with livestock who will be entrusting another party with the care of those animals, it's safe to assume both parties will have a lot invested in these types of agreements. This being the case, you'll want both parties to be on the same page before any agreement is reached, and there are a number of questions you should raise before a bargain is struck.
So you want to make sure that everybody is clear on what's going to happen. The very first thing that you probably want to talk about is when would the cattle be cared for, right? So the date that the cattle would arrive at the care location and the date that they would be expected to leave. A couple things about that, especially the date they're expected to leave. Depending on the system, like in Nebraska, a lot of winter cow care agreements have to do with corn residue. And how much corn residue is available depends a lot on the weather, right? So some years we may have some ice storm events that happen and the corn residue is no longer available. If they agreed to take in cattle, let's say, and care for them on corn residue, and corn residue is no longer available, you may want to be able to have a caveat that the price changes or that the cattle have to go home after corn residue is no longer available. So you may put some flexibility in there, or it may be a hard date and you have a plan for weather events and what you're going to do. But it needs to be discussed because that's something that's very important because everybody has to be lined up for how they're going to handle those cattle. They have to go somewhere, right? So if they're going to be at the care providing location, that person's going to have to be planned for it. If they're going to go back home, that person has to plan for it.
If you're taking in cattle to graze on your land, one bit of information you'll want up front is the body condition score of the cattle you intend to care for over the harsh winter months.
But when cattle are coming in, particularly if you're thinking about cows, body condition score is really important in terms of their ability, for instance, to weather cold. And also there's an expectation, right, that if I have the cattle coming in, what do you want them to look like on the other side, right? And so you should have a discussion about that as well. Do I need them to maintain? Do I need them to gain weight? Is it okay if they lose a little condition? Probably want to have a body condition score done when the cattle come in so everybody is comfortable with, yes, okay, I think I agree to that, and then the same thing at the end. And again, having a third party do that makes a lot of sense. So everybody's clear on what the situation is and what the ramifications would be if it wasn't what was agreed upon.
Caring for cattle is usually anything but predictable. There are a number of things that could take an unexpected turn for the worst. With that in mind, it's a good idea to hash out which party will take on the responsibility and expense for things such as animal health care.
What's the process there in terms of who's responsible for those costs? Is there some threshold that is going to be used by the care provider and that's included in the cost, and above that, it's going to be paid for by the owner? One of the things that may be really useful is for you to have an agreement upon the fact that if you have a sick animal, there's going to be a communication between the two parties, and they're going to decide together what's going to be done. And in particular, are we going to get a vet involved and bring them in and have them take care of the process, and then who's going to pay for that, of course. But usually it's really good just to have that communication, especially if you have, the one-offs are one thing, like you have some freak event and an animal, steps on something and has a lame hoof or something. But the process, like for instance, if you do have a bout of sickness go through the cattle, what's the procedure that you're going to flow through to be able to maintain the health and the care of those animals appropriately?